Okay, so pyramids, right?
Yeah.
Those iconic Egyptian pyramids. You see them and, well, it's hard not to be kind of blown away. I mean, there are these huge triangles just sticking up out of the desert, and you just feel like, wow, something ancient, something powerful.
Yeah, I totally get that. They really do have this presence.
But you know our listeners, right?
Oh, yeah.
They always want to dig a little deeper,
Right.
beyond the sort of postcard image, see what's really going on. And that's kind of what we're all about, right? So today we're going deep, a deep dive into the world of the Egyptian pyramids.
A deep dive it is. And not just the cool architecture, but the stories, the truths behind them.
Yeah.
Some of those are, well, maybe a little less glamorous. We're going to be looking at history, science, even some of the wilder theories out there to really try and grasp what these pyramids are all about.
Exactly. We've got a whole pile of really interesting sources here, and our job today is to pull out the juicy bits.
The good stuff.
The stuff that makes you think. So, we'll be looking at how they actually built these things, the kind of society that could pull this off, some surprising science, and then even how they still affect us today, these ancient wonders.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. So first up, we'll be digging into the reality of how these pyramids were built and the society that made it happen. Then we'll move into some of the more intriguing, sometimes controversial scientific claims.
Oh, I like controversial.
Oh, we'll get there. Then we'll look at those cosmic connections that people are always fascinated by. And finally, we'll tackle the sometimes less talked about aspects: modern tourism and cultural appropriation. It's a journey, folks, to understand the whole story, the good, the bad, and the complicated.
Absolutely. All right, so picture this. Powerful pharaoh, vast kingdom. I think a lot of us, when we think of the pyramids, we think of slaves, right?
Yeah, that's the classic image, isn't it?
Backbreaking labor under the hot sun, armies of people in chains. But is that what the archaeology actually shows?
It's interesting because, that image, powerful as it is, it doesn't really line up with what we're finding around the pyramid sites. We're discovering these worker villages, not just random shacks, but places with, like, actual organization. And importantly, burial sites.
Burial sites, so they weren't just left to rot in the desert.
Exactly. And these graves tell a story. They suggest workers organized into crews, sometimes with their own crew names. They were given rations and get this, beer
Ear!
as a form of payment. Egyptians loved their beer. So not just some random mass of forced labor.
Wow, so these weren't just like random people grabbed off the street and forced to drag stones.
It seems not. The level of organization, the food, the beer, even the care they took with the burials suggests a workforce that, while, doing seriously hard work, had some kind of status within the society. It points to a level of planning, of resource management that goes way beyond just rounding up a bunch of people. Makes you think about those power structures in ancient Egypt, the skills people had.
Okay, so not exactly slaves, but our sources also talk about harsh conditions. I mean, hauling those giant stones can't have been a walk in the park, paid or not.
Definitely not. While the evidence suggests they weren't slaves in the, classic sense, the work was brutal. Imagine the physical strain of quarrying, dragging, lifting these multi-ton blocks all under the scorching Egyptian sun. And when we look at the skeletons from those worker cemeteries, we see signs of, well, intense labor, injuries, and shorter lifespans. It was a hard life, no doubt.
So compensated, but definitely not comfortable.
Exactly. And then we have this term forced labor, which it's a bit of a subtle distinction, right, from straight-up slavery.
Yeah.
How do historians understand that in this context?
Yeah, it's a bit fuzzy, isn't it?
It is. It really raises this question of obligation, service, in ancient Egypt. Some historians argue that, sure, these workers were paid, they were skilled, but maybe their involvement in these huge state projects wasn't exactly, let's say, voluntary in the way we think of it today.
Like they couldn't just say, no thanks, I'd rather be a farmer.
Right. So the idea is the state could conscript labor for these projects as a form of civic duty, like you see in other ancient societies where citizens had obligations to, contribute their labor for a certain time, serve the state.
Interesting. So they got something for it, but it wasn't necessarily a choice between this and something else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was tied to their citizenship, their place in society, which kind of gives us a different perspective on ancient Egypt, right? Not just about the pharaohs at the top. And that brings us to social inequality. I mean, these pyramids, they weren't like community projects, right?
No, not exactly a neighborhood barn raising.
Not quite. We have to remember the main point of these pyramids was to glorify the pharaohs, to make their divine status very, very clear. And these things were massive. It meant a huge chunk of the kingdom's resources, people, materials, all going towards building these giant tombs.
And that means those resources weren't going towards, well, anything else.
Exactly. Maybe things that could have benefited more people, the general population.
Our source even calls them monumental vanity projects.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong statement.
It is.
But it does highlight how much wealth and power was concentrated in the hands of the pharaohs and the ruling class. The labor of so many people, all to create these lasting symbols of their power, their supposed connection to the gods. And this concentration of power, of resources around the pharaoh, it also made them vulnerable, their heritage, to outside forces later on.
Which brings us to another dark truth, colonial exploitation. You know, it's not something you automatically think of with these ancient pyramids, but our material makes a connection.
It's important, right? It's about how the legacy of these pyramids was shaped centuries later by the actions of, well, mainly European explorers and archaeologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries. We saw a lot of looting of artifacts from the pyramids from other sites all over Egypt. These incredibly valuable historical objects, they ended up in museums, private collections in Europe, basically stripping Egypt of its own heritage.
Wow. So these pieces of history that could have helped Egyptians today understand their own past, they were just taken?
Taken and put on display somewhere else.
That's just wrong.
It is, and it wasn't always a purely academic thing either. A lot of it was tied to the Eurocentric views of the time. You know, some of those early Egyptologists, they couldn't quite grasp how advanced the ancient Egyptians were.
So they had to come up with some other explanation.
Exactly. They downplayed their achievements, suggested that, well, someone else must have helped them, some superior influence, maybe even aliens.
Wow. Like they couldn't believe that Egyptians did it on their own.
Right. It's a reflection of those colonial biases, a failure to see the ingenuity, the capabilities of these ancient African civilizations. And these narratives, they really twisted our understanding of Egyptian history, pushed the Egyptian people aside even further.
It's amazing how, something that happened so long ago still has these echoes today.
Yeah, it's all connected. Okay, so we've talked about the realities of building the pyramids and then how their legacy was exploited. Let's shift gears a bit now and talk about the scientific dark truths. Our material mentions this idea of lost knowledge. What's that all about?
Yeah, fill us in.
Well, when you look at how precise the construction of the pyramids is, it's mind-blowing. I mean, the Great Pyramid of Giza, it's aligned to true north with an error of like a fraction of a degree.
That's crazy.
Right, and then you have these incredibly sophisticated mathematical ratios in their design, engineering techniques that seem way ahead of their time. It's led some people to believe that the ancient Egyptians, they knew a lot more than we give them credit for, especially about math, astronomy, engineering, and that maybe some of that knowledge, it got lost over time,
Right.
or we just haven't rediscovered it yet.
So it wasn't just brute force, it was brains too.
Absolutely. And this is where things can get a little, well, speculative. Some theorists take this idea of advanced lost knowledge and they run with it. They say maybe it was deliberately suppressed, hidden away.
Ooh, conspiracy theories.
Well, kind of. This leads to ideas about secret chambers in the pyramids, holding this lost wisdom, or maybe undiscovered technologies, or even connections to, like, other lost civilizations.
Lost civilizations, that's always a good one.
It's definitely intriguing. But, and this is important, our source also warns about pseudoscience and misinformation.
Right, where's the line between a fun theory and just making stuff up?
Exactly. And that line gets blurry when people start presenting guesses as facts without any real scientific evidence. The pyramids, they're mysterious, no doubt, so they attract all sorts of wild claims. Aliens building them, mystical energies, ancient power plants. But none of that has any real scientific backing.
So fun to think about maybe, but not very helpful in actually understanding the pyramids.
Exactly. And our source argues that this kind of pseudoscience can actually be harmful, because it distracts from what the ancient Egyptians actually accomplished. You know, it takes away from their ingenuity, their human effort, and replaces it with, well, fantasy. And that ends up distorting our view of history, of their civilization.
It's like saying, oh, they couldn't have possibly done this, so it must have been aliens.
Right, like we're underestimating human potential.
Okay, let's move on to something that, honestly, I never really thought about before. The environmental impact of building these massive pyramids. You don't usually think about ancient history and the environment in the same breath.
No, you don't. But when you think about the scale of these projects, the environmental effects must have been significant. Think about it. They needed huge amounts of materials, limestone, granite, all kinds of stone.
Tons and tons of it.
Literally tons. And that stone had to be quarried, often using fire and manual labor. and then transported, sometimes over huge distances. That means clearing land, building roads, and all of that probably involved a lot of deforestation.
For fuel, right.
Exactly. And then you have the potential for soil erosion, habitat disruption around the quarries. It wasn't a very environmentally friendly process.
So not exactly sustainable by today's standards.
No, definitely not. And consuming all those resources, it probably had long-term effects on the landscape of ancient Egypt, maybe even contributed to resource depletion, which would have had social and economic consequences too. Concentrating resources in the hands of the people running these massive projects.
Makes you think, right? Even these wonders of the ancient world, they came at a cost.
They did. Okay, ready for something a bit more cosmic. Let's talk about space and cosmic connections, which always seem to come up when we talk about pyramids. Our material highlights the astronomical alignment of the pyramids. How precise are we talking here?
Yeah, lay it on us.
It's really remarkable. We mentioned before that the Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with like a tiny margin of error, just 0.15 degrees. For a structure built thousands of years ago, that kind of accuracy suggests they knew a lot about astronomy and survey.
So not just accidentally pointing in the right direction?
No, it was intentional. And the general consensus is that this alignment was deeply symbolic, tied to their whole cosmology.
So it wasn't just about building a straight pyramid, it was about connecting to something bigger.
Exactly. They saw the stars as the realm of the gods, so aligning the pyramids with specific stars, constellations, it was probably a way to help the pharaoh's soul ascend to the afterlife to join those gods.
Now, this ties into the Orion correlation theory, which has gotten a lot of attention. What's the main idea there?
So Robert Bauval, he's the one who came up with this theory. He says that the layout of the three main pyramids at Giza, the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafre, and the Pyramid of Menkaure, they directly mirror the three stars in Orion's belt.
That's pretty cool.
It is, right?
Right.
And Bauval argues that this alignment, it shows just how deeply connected the ancient Egyptians were to the stars, especially to Orion. Orion was associated with Osiris, a god linked to death and rebirth, very important in their beliefs.
So visually it makes sense, but do most archaeologists buy into this theory?
It's a bit mixed, actually. It's a really captivating idea, and it has definitely caught the public imagination. But within the archaeological community, it's still debated. Not everyone agrees. Critics point out that the correlation isn't perfect and that Bauval maybe cherry-picks some of the evidence. So while the ancient Egyptians definitely knew their way around the night sky, whether the Giza layout was meant to be an exact map of Orion, well, that's still up for debate.
And of course, we can't talk about pyramids in space without mentioning the alien theories. Our source seems to have a pretty clear opinion on those.
Yeah, mainstream science pretty much rejects the idea that aliens helped build the pyramids. These theories often come from people not understanding or underestimating the engineering skills, the organizational abilities of ancient humans.
It's so impressive. It must be aliens.
Right. But the thing is, while the scale, the precision, they are amazing, ultimately, the pyramids are a testament to human ingenuity, to planning, and to a lot of hard work over a long period of time. No aliens required.
So impressive. Yes, otherworldly, maybe, but definitely made by humans here on Earth. All right, we've covered a lot of ground. History, science, even a little bit of space. Let's wrap up by talking about the dark truth of modern exploitation. How are these ancient sites still being negatively impacted today?
One of the biggest issues is tourism. It's huge for Egypt, brings in a lot of money, and it lets people from all over the world experience these incredible monuments.
It's on everyone's bucket list, right?
It is. But the problem is, so many visitors, it takes a toll. All those footsteps, people touching the stones, even the changes in humidity and temperature from the crowds, it can cause damage over time. And that threatens the preservation of these pyramids for, future generations.
Yeah, you want your grandkids to be able to see them, too.
Exactly. And it's not just the crowds, it's the commercial side of tourism, too.
Oh, yeah, the gift shops, the vendors.
Exactly. The areas around the pyramids, they've become very commercialized. Unregulated tours, pushy vendors, cheap souvenirs that are often fake. It really takes away from the historical atmosphere, and sometimes it even leads to more damage, people stealing little pieces as souvenirs or just being disrespectful to the monuments.
Yeah, that's a shame.
It is. And finally, we have cultural appropriation. This is a term we hear a lot, but it's interesting to think about it in the context of something so ancient. How does it play out with the pyramids?
Yeah, explain that one.
Well, the pyramids, they're like these ultimate symbols of ancient Egypt, right?
Yeah, instantly recognizable.
Exactly. So they've been adopted, reinterpreted by all sorts of groups over the years, often without any real understanding of what they originally meant, their context. New Age groups use pyramid shapes in their practices. Conspiracy theorists use them to back up their claims, but it's all detached from the actual history and culture.
So it's like taking something that has deep meaning for one culture and using it for something completely different.
Exactly. It leads to misunderstanding, and it's disrespectful to the heritage of Egypt. It's taking these monuments out of their roots and using them to fit modern agendas that have nothing to do with their original purpose.
It's like they're just props, not real historical objects.
Yeah, and that's a problem.
Hmm.
Well, I don't know about you, but this deep dive has really been eye-opening for me.
Me too. We started with this image of these majestic, timeless pyramids, and we've uncovered a much more complicated story.
Definitely.
The reality of the labor, the social inequalities, the colonial exploitation, the environmental cost, and even the challenges they face today with tourism and appropriation. It's a lot more nuanced, a lot more, well, yeah, darker than those pretty pictures suggest.
The key takeaway, I think, is that while the Egyptian pyramids are incredible achievements, they represent a complex society with a complex history. And that history includes a human cost, a legacy that continues to this day. We have to look beyond that romanticized image and see the whole picture, the good and the bad.
So next time you see a picture of the pyramids, or if you're lucky enough to actually visit them, maybe you'll see more than just those massive triangles.
I hope so.
Maybe you'll think about the ambition of the pharaohs, the skill and the struggles of the people who built them, the vast sweep of history, and even how we connect to the past today. It makes you wonder, what other ancient wonders out there have these hidden, complicated stories? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring.